If you could find this treasure, you would be a billionaire. But that's a big if. Leon Trabuco is the one most famously attributed to this, but he was not the only one involved. He and several of his companions had gotten together and decided that they would buy up as much gold as they could. They would then have it melted down into ingots to be smuggled into the US. Then all they would have to do is wait for the price of gold to increase, and they would have easily doubled their money. However, they came into a bit of trouble, and their misfortune could be somebody else's find of a lifetime.
I get an awful lot of stories coming to us after 30 years in the business, and probably about 80 or 90% of them you have to chalk up to some fictional writer as writing a book or magazine, but this one has a ring of authenticity to it.
Thank you for joining me today in the discussion and examination of Leon Trabuco's gold. So let's pretend you're actually wanting to go out and find this incredible treasure hoard. First, we need to understand the man, the reason, and the way that he and his companions plan to go through with this. In 1833, a secret meeting was held. Professor Guzman Morada called for a small group of incredibly wealthy individuals in Cuernavaca, Mexico. What makes Professor Morada so important is that he was on the Economics Council of the University of Mexico. Present at this secret meeting were the infamous Leon Trabuco, rancher and large-scale miner from Chihuahua, Mexico; Ricardo Artega, another wealthy rancher from Torreon, Mexico; Carlos Sepulveda, a rancher from Chihuahua; and Rafael Borega, international banker for Spain and Mexico. While these men were holding their secret meeting, the reason for them doing so was that there was quite a bit of trouble brewing in the US. In 1929, 4 years before their secret meeting, the US had gone into what we now know as the Great Depression, a brutal worldwide economic hardship that would last for 10 years. The stock market had crashed, and there was a collapse of world trade. These are just a couple of the major reasons the Great Depression occurred, but where some saw struggle, strife, and financial degradation, the men in this secret meeting saw an opportunity. This here is about half a gram of gold, and it's probably worth around 40 to 50 bucks nowadays. However, back in 1933, you could buy 50 of these with around 20 bucks. And that's essentially what this group of millionaires had planned to do. Professor Morada had explained that through his connections with the United States, he believed the Depression would soon end, and when it did, the price of gold would skyrocket. At that time, the price of gold was around $20 per ounce, and he had explained that it would potentially double that amount within the years that followed after the inevitable end of the Great Depression. So Leon, Ricardo, Rafael, Carlos, and Professor Morada began their simple yet brilliant plan. The group began buying as much gold as they could get their hands on. They bought rings, bracelets, necklaces. Ricardo and Carlos gave millions to Rafael so that he could buy even more gold from private Mexican miners. They would then smelt down all the jewelry and raw gold at a makeshift foundry to be cast into solid gold ingots. And by the time they had acquired all that they could get their hands on, the group was sitting on 16 tons of pure gold, 12 of which were put in by Leon Trabuco. Now they just had to get their hoard of gold to the United States. But they couldn't let either of the governments know. Mexico's laws strictly forbid the exportation of gold, and likewise, the US really didn't want people smuggling contraband into the States, but luckily, Professor Morada had already thought of that. This is where some people may disagree on the story. Supposedly, Professor Morada hired a crop dusting pilot from Utah to fly the gold from Mexico to New Mexico. This man had a 440 horsepower plane along with extra fuel, so when it came to making these million-dollar flights, there wouldn't be an issue. And there wasn't too much concern about being caught back then because the skies just weren't as heavily monitored as they are today. In one version, the pilot's name is William C. Elliott. However, other versions say that he never gave his name to the people he was working with. Some say the only correct information we have is the alias he gave them, the Red Moisier, which is kind of ironic because a Moisier is somebody who actually double crosses you or gives you information. So after Leon met with the pilot, the Red Moisier began making flights from Mexico to New Mexico, and the only reason we know this is because of the senior treasure hunter on the topic, Ed Foster. Ed Foster has been searching for Leon Trabuco's gold for 35 years, and he believes he's narrowed it down to one specific area, but more on Ed Foster and the area in a minute. After the pilot made these 16 flights back and forth, the group decided the safest thing to do would be to bury the gold. Now, why did they decide to bury it instead of selling it? Well, Uncle Sam didn't like the idea of individuals being able to own gold, so President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to institute the Executive Order 6102, the Gold Reserve Act, which meant unless you had a special license, you were not allowed to keep gold, and since all of Leon's gold was illegally exported, they couldn't do anything with it. Essentially, they were sitting on 16 tons of trash. And from 1934 to 1974, it was illegal for anyone in the US to own gold. And during that time, each one of these men would strangely die unnatural deaths. Rafael would pass away in his office in Mexico in 1939. Carlos was killed in a car crash outside of Monterrey in 1940. The pilot supposedly joined the Air Force and was killed in action in 1944 in Germany. As for Morada and Ricardo, it is said they also passed away, but how they died is still a mystery. All of these tragically odd and coincidental deaths happened until finally, the only one left was Leon Trabuco. And years after their deaths, Trabuco had sold his mines and his ranches and moved to Spain. He would later visit Mexico City in 1962 to speak with his lawyer, but would later again return to Spain, where he would die at the age of 86. The U.S. Treasury and Justice Departments had made inquiries to Trabuco's lawyers, but the outcome is unknown. As far as anyone knows, the 16 tons of gold are still buried somewhere off in the New Mexico desert. Now, Leon Trabuco supposedly said one thing about the location of the gold, but I'm going to save that for the end, so make sure you stick around. Ed Foster has been searching for Leon Trabuco's gold relentlessly, and he's come up with some incredible information. He had interviewed a Ute lady that said she had seen a plane landing and taking off from the same mesa over and over and over again. Around the time, she was only 6 years old, but she had noticed there was a lot of Mexican men around the plane that also lived nearby. Normally, this wouldn't be unusual, except for the fact that she lived on a Native American reservation, and there was no other Mexicans around. And during Ed Foster's research, he happened upon a house that was unlike any other. This house had windows and a front door and a back door. And you may be saying, big deal, my house has windows and a front door and a back door too, except this was on a Native American reservation, and the Utes' home looked nothing like this. This house in and of itself was an anomaly. It shouldn't be here. According to Ed, this house would look at home in Tijuana, Mexico, rather than a Native American reservation in the United States. And this isn't the only thing Ed discovered on his search. That same woman who was only 6 years old was able to point out where the plane would land. And the mesa on which she watched these Mexican men speak and deal with the pilot was Conger Mesa, which is about 20 miles away from this house. So now we have an unusual occurrence in which these Mexican men were dealing with a pilot on Conger Mesa that just so happened to be about 30 minutes away from the Mexican-style house that honestly had no business being there. Now, you may just be saying this is all just one big coincidence and it's just a story that actually isn't true, but this third anomaly will prove this isn't just an accident. There's a stone that has carved into it 1933 16 ton. And if anything, this at least gives us undeniable evidence that Leon and his companions really did hide 16 tons of gold in the New Mexican desert. So now, where is it? Well, that's the billion-dollar question. Where is this gold so that way you or I can go out there and claim it for ourselves? Well, if I knew, I would have been long gone, and unfortunately I haven't been studying this treasure the way I did the Forrest Fenn treasure hunt. However, in the future, if this channel does become a big thing, I'd honestly love to just go out and look for where this gold is at, but for now that's just a dream. But honestly, Ed Foster would have been the man, if anyone, to be the one to find Leon Trabuco's gold. He combined all three of these features and came up with a general area of where to search. Conger Mesa is about 20 miles from the hacienda, and that appears to be around the same distance from what Ed has named Shrine Rock. So it stands to reason that the 16 tons of gold bars that was smuggled across the US and Mexico border is somewhere within the triangle created by these three landmarks: the house, Shrine Rock, and Conger Mesa. So why hasn't Ed found this treasure hoard yet? Well, perhaps because gold is some of the most dense stuff known to man, and while 16 tons in vehicles would look like 6 to 8 cars, 16 tons of gold is probably more like the size of a sofa. And when that sofa is buried in the New Mexico desert with no visual indication where it is at all, let's put it this way, A needle in a haystack would eventually poke you and you'd find it that way. But this is more like me throwing this needle into Lake Lanier. And also, I haven't been able to find any information on Ed Foster recently, so it's very possible he's passed away now. But wait, have you already forgotten what I told you earlier? What's the one thing that Leon Trabuco is alleged to have said about the location of the gold on his deathbed? Well, right before I do that, please like the video and subscribe because it does so much for the growth of the channel. Seriously, if I can grow this into being a full-time thing, I won't only be talking about treasure, you and I are actually going to go out and look for this treasure. So go ahead and hit subscribe, and thank you in advance. Leon was laying in his bed as his family gathered around. Surely they had known about his past business venture to double his wealth with the gold he and his friends hid. So he's close to passing away, and his family sits patiently around him as they say their final goodbyes. Leon reveals something incredibly exciting. He says to them, "The gold is hidden only a few miles away from a New Mexico landmark." And with that possibly being his final words, you and I are forced to wonder, which landmark? And did Professor Morada and Ricardo actually pass away, or did they fake their deaths? Did Leon really say this? Perhaps the real treasure is the thrill of the chase. If so, then you probably love treasure hunts just as much as me, especially the ones that aren't just a thing of fiction. If so, then you'll definitely want to check out this video here, where I talk about a real-life treasure hunt that includes fortune, glory, and death. Thanks for watching.